All right, if you will open up to Acts chapter 14. Acts chapter 14. We'll get started in verse 1. If you can remember from the tail end of Acts chapter 13, whenever Paul and Barnabas are in the town before here, that they have gone through, and it has just really come to the point in time where Paul and Barnabas say, the Jews have had their opportunity, now it's time to turn to the Gentiles. And really the doors kind of come busting open. We know that in previous chapters, back in chapter 10, you had Cornelius, a Gentile convert. Even if you go back to Acts chapter 6, there was a man back there who was a proselyte, one of the 7 men that were put forward to serve the widows that were there. And so Gentiles have been scarcely mentioned up until you get through here. And all of a sudden at the end of 13, the Gentiles are rejoicing, they're believing in the word, and they respond. And then at the end of 13, Paul and Barnabas shake the dust off their feet as a witness against them, and they come to Iconium. And if you notice in verse 52 of chapter 13, and the disciples were continually filled with joy and with the Holy Spirit, and realize they are so excited to be adopted into this family of God, just like the Jews had been adopted in. But now chapter 14 opens up, and you come to another city that probably we would consider to be in Asia Minor, or modern-day Turkey. It says, in Iconium they entered the synagogue of the Jews together and spoke in such a manner that a large number of people believed, both of Jews and of Greeks. And when you see this together, it sounds kind of odd, doesn't it? Because at the end of 13, it's like, we're turning to the Gentiles. But notice, where do they go first? The synagogue, the place of the Jews. And so in doing that, here's my question to you. Why? Why do they still go to the synagogue first? Meeting place, their countrymen, and you realize, go ahead.
Because they're going to know about the prophecies. If they are Jews and they're at the synagogue, they're going to know the old law and the coming of Jesus. So that's a good starting place.
Right. They already have the grassroots efforts in terms of knowing the old covenant, knowing the prophecies of the prophets, and to go, here's Paul going into town. Let's start off with the ground that should be fertile. And so let's take this message of Jesus, bring it into them. They get the first opportunity. If you go back and read through the book of Romans, you see it over and over and over again. To the Jews first, and then to the Greeks. Or to the Jews first, then to the Gentiles. It's like, these were God's people. Let's take it to them first. They should be readily available to see these things. It doesn't mean they did, but to pull out of the Jews first. So, even though now the major portion of things are moving toward the Gentiles, it doesn't mean the Jews are being left behind. Whenever you're going to see it, it'll keep on going through the book of Acts. When Paul and those who are his companions come to a city, if it has a synagogue, that's where they're going to start. And to go, we can find people of faith, all of a sudden you get the church established in these different locations. Something else to take note of here in verse 1. He says, it spoke in such a manner that a large number of people believed, both of Jews and Greeks. You might look at that and go, Jews and Greeks? What are Greeks doing in the synagogue? But I want you to realize, it's been enough time where they're still around the areas of the Greek civilization. So they're Jews, but they've already had another few generations to where now they're Greeks, but they're still Jews. Kind of like you think about someone who's born in, let's just say Germany, and they come to America, they migrate, come to America, and then they start having children. Well, what do you call their children in this country? They're Americans. Now they still have a Germanic, lineage. Same picture. You have Jews, but now they've been there in enough generations that now Jews and Greeks. So you see how it comes together here? It's because you don't have people who are not Jews in the synagogue. That just doesn't happen unless they've become proselytes. In other words, converted Gentiles to Judaism. So just know that kind of going in. Verse 2. But the Jews who disbelieved stirred up the minds of the Gentiles and embittered them against the brethren. Those who don't believe, who are they going to? The Gentiles. We're not dealing just within those that are in the synagogue. Now they're going out in the town of Iconium and they're stirring up the people to embitter them against the brethren. Not just Paul and Barnabas. This is against anyone else who came to faith in Jesus to respond and be baptized and converted. So there's a name for that in the New Testament. Can you think of a term that the New Testament uses where you go out and you stir people up to embitter them against somebody else? What's the word? Insurgent. Division, riots. Do you ever think of words like slander? Because isn't that the goal of slander? Is to, let me tell you something about this person so that you don't like them anymore or you think less of them. That's what slander is. You think in terms of malice. There's another word for it. And to go, malice is whenever it gets to the point where not only do you want to speak evil of them, you want them to be attacked. Medical word in terms of cancer, if something is malignant, in other words, it's working off of malice, that means it's attacking something, right? I mean, lung cancer, when it's malignant, it attacks the lungs. Same on down through whatever organ you start to think of. Now, I want to take this thought for a moment, and I want to look over at the book of Colossians, chapter 3. Because we need to understand to make sure these are not the things that are at work in us. Colossians chapter 3. Colossians chapter 3, and look down at verse 6. He's just talked about earlier in Colossians 3 about setting your mind on things above, not on the things that are on earth. He comes to verse 6. He's just mentioned several things in verse 5. Immorality, impurity, passion, evil desire, greed, idolatry. He says, for it is because of these things that the wrath of God will come upon the sons of disobedience. Whenever there's no obedience to God, what is coming? Wrath of God. Here's another parallel. What did Jesus take for us? He took the wrath of God for us. Now, he says, because of these things, he says, this is why the wrath of God comes upon the sons of disobedience. So what do you expect to happen to those Jews back there in Iconium whenever they're going around and slandering God's people? Do you expect God to go, well, that's just the way it is? Do you expect the wrath of God to come in some form? Verse 7. He says, and in them you also once walked when you were living in them. Did we ever come out of these kind of things? Did we ever work off of these whenever we were still in the world and outside of Christ? We did. And it's interesting, he says, in them you also once walked when you were living in them. Specifically talking to these saints at Colossae. Verse 8. But now you also put them all aside. Anger, wrath, malice, slander, and abusive speech from your mouth. He says, all those things have to go. Now, I want you to kind of see the progression of how things go. Notice here in verse 8. He says, all these have to be put aside, but he starts off with anger. Now, I know sometimes anger can be seen on the outside, but there are times where people can be angry and it's just under the surface. You really don't see it. If you ask them, how are you doing? I'm doing fine. Okay. And you think, here's anger. That's kind of the undercurrent that goes on. Then you look at the next step. He says wrath. Now, wrath is where anger actually starts to present itself, right? So here comes, at first anger is kind of an undercurrent. Then as it grows into wrath, to where now you can see it. They want to go after, they want to attack. And then you go from anger to wrath. What's our next word? Malice. Now I want to attack. I want to tell you, I want these people to have something happen to them. And we think, well, boy, I would never think that. You go, I want them to get what's coming to them. That's malice. It's borderline vengeance. Then the next word, malice is once again a desire. Now, how does it present itself even further? Slander. Now I'm going to tell you things about this person so that you don't think so highly of them. Maybe you'll join my team in being against them. That's how slander works. And once again, slander doesn't have to be a lie. Sometimes we think, well, I'm telling them the truth. Think in these terms. Before you were converted to Christ, would you be okay with people telling the truth about all the things that you used to do? You probably wouldn't want that, would you? Now, if we say them, maybe we're giving some illustration about it, but to go, slander can be, well, I remember how they used to treat me 10 years ago. Okay, but they've been forgiven. Why are we still unforgiving? And some people talk about events that are like 30 years ago and talk about them like they happened yesterday. Trying to shape the way you consider and think about this person, to change your attitude toward them. And you go, that's slander. Now, realize there's another phrase here. What comes after slander? Abusive speech. Now, this doesn't necessarily have to mean like, oh, foul words. Abusive speech, and I don't know if you've ever had this happen. I feel like you probably have. Sometimes you tell somebody hello, like you don't really know them, and the very first thing they do is they want to tell you about how bad somebody is, and you go, I don't even know who that is. And you're thinking, how did I get in the middle of this? You realize that's abusive speech. I don't even care if you know them or not. I'm just going to tell you about how terrible they are. Well, to realize none of those things should be part of us as God's people. And to realize if that is part of us, guess what's coming? The wrath of God's coming. Because all of a sudden you get called into some situation and go, did you say this about somebody? And you're going, yeah. If you got abusive speech, you don't even care who you tell. You're so dead spiritually. So you see this play out. And the reason I want to show this aspect to you, come back over to Acts 14. So where does this tell you where these unbelieving or disbelieving, and disbelief carries with it that idea of you have heard it, you have rejected it. So here the message of Jesus has been brought right before them, and they're going, we've heard you, and no way. They disbelieve. It's not just an unbelief. It's disbelief, to reject. He says, and because of that disbelief, I want you to notice what's going on inside of them. Is it not anger and wrath and malice and slander and abusive speech? And to go, what is remaining upon these disbelieving Jews? The wrath of God. Now, here's their standing before God. And they take this to such an amount that they don't just talk to the Jews. Now who are they reaching out to? The Gentiles that are living there in Iconium. And you'll see here beyond that here in a moment. He says, embittering them against the brethren. Oh, against God's people. Now, we're not talking about the Jews. We're talking about those of the way. Those who have chosen to follow Jesus and have been converted to Christ. He says, embittered them against the brethren. He says, they go to stir them up. And slander can be words that are true, but slander can also be words that are just flat out lies.
Another verse that comes to mind when I hear this is Proverbs 6 about the things God hates.
Right.
About the false witness who speaks lies and one who sows discord
Among the brethren.
I think that's some strong language about how God really feels about those that sow this discord.
And you think about even in terms of when you look about those 6 things that God hates, 7 an abomination in Proverbs 6, nearly all of them have to do with the tongue. Not all of them, but nearly all of them. And you go, here it is, and you think, here it is being poured out, and you see, here's God's response. Then, notice verse 3. Therefore they, and the they is Paul and Barnabas, therefore they spent a long time there speaking boldly with reliance upon the Lord. Why would it take reliance upon the Lord to speak boldly?
Got a lot of discord, got a lot of stirring up going on, so you have to really probably tread very, very carefully to make sure you get the right message.
Right. And as you realize, there's a strong opposition here. And a lot of times we think, well, there's a strong opposition, so this must not be a good opportunity. But I want you to really think about that for a moment. Because look over at 1 Corinthians. 1 Corinthians chapter 16. I want you to kind of notice. Look at verse 8. Now this, whenever Paul writes to Corinth, you're going to see him mention Ephesus, but I want you to see the principle at hand. 1 Corinthians 16, verse 8. He says, but I will remain in Ephesus until Pentecost, verse 9. For a wide door for effective service has opened to me. Now think about it. Here's a wide open door for service, but notice the rest of the verse. And there are many adversaries, many enemies. Now, typically, that's not the way we describe a wide open door, is it? We think if there's a lot of adversaries, then this is probably a shut door. That's not always the case. We got to be careful in how we see what's in front of us. Because here's Paul saying, you know what, I'm going to stay here in Ephesus. He says, there's a lot of enemies, a lot of those who are adversaries. He says, but there's a wide open door here for service. So, does this sound similar to what Paul saw in Iconium? A lot of people embittered against those of the way. But what does he notice? There's still opportunity here. Now, come back to Acts chapter 14.
So Paul would be the perfect one because, look, he was
He had been an adversary.
so he would say, yeah, this is right now.
This is right it. And so whenever you see Acts 14:3, it says, therefore they spent a long time there speaking boldly with reliance upon the Lord. And you realize the boldness is they're relying upon the Lord for that boldness. Don't think, well, they're just taking their own thing and they're going and running with it. And in doing that, he says, who is testifying to the word of his grace, granting that signs and wonders be done by their hands. And notice, was God giving a confirmation to what they were doing? Certainly. You can probably read about it in more detail, like in Mark 16:20. It talks about the miraculous things that the apostles were doing after Jesus ascended, of going, they were to confirm the word that was being taught. And you go, the miracles were not a wow factor. They were not the spectacle sideshow. If you notice many, many times through miracles, the miracle takes place and all it does is confirm exactly what's been taught. Now, you see the picture here. It says, testifying to the word of his grace. Look, grace from what? What do these people deserve? The wrath of God. What did we deserve? The wrath of God. And what did God show through His Son? Grace. Can you imagine so many times the people who are the most embittered, the most adversarial, working against what's good, turn into those who are the most humble? And has already been brought up. That's exactly what happened with Saul until he came to be Paul. So Paul didn't look at these people and go, this is a terrible opportunity. He goes, this might just be it. Because when things get the darkest, that's when the light shines the brightest, right? So he doesn't give up in here. And he continues on. And sure enough, there's a reassurance of going, and here's God allowing these miraculous things to take place. He's going to bring one up here shortly in a different town. But verse 4, he says, but the people of the city were divided, and some sided with the Jews and some with the apostles. He says, but the city as a whole is divided. It's not like it's, 20% this way, 80% another. But you go, it's divided. Even among the Jews, he says, some sided with those embittered Jews, some sided with the apostles. And you think in terms of, man, here's Paul. And to go, you know what, which way are you going to go? Now I want you to think about apostles. What did you have to have in your resume, let's put it that way, to be an apostle? Had to be with Jesus from the time of John the Baptist until his ascension. Had to see Jesus after he was resurrected. Had to be an eyewitness to his resurrection. You go, are you going to side with the Jews who are here locally, who are embittered against the apostles? Or are you going to side with those who are giving you the teachings of Jesus, who are eyewitnesses to those teachings, and also eyewitnesses to his resurrection and ascension? Where are you going to fit in here? Because that's the divided aspect of the city. Now, he continues on, verse 5. And when an attempt was made by both the Gentiles and the Jews with their rulers to mistreat and to stone them, they became aware of it and fled to the cities of Lycaonia, Lystra, and Derbe, and the surrounding regions. And there they continued to preach the gospel. They realized, you know what? They're going to try and kill us. They don't say, well, let's just stay and let them. And I want you to also notice, they're not running scared either. They're like, you know what? We've done everything we can do here. It's up to these new saints to continue in this. And it's not like they go out and stir up the fight and then walk away. It's like, this is just what takes place. And so they move on to these next three cities, Lycaonia, Lystra, and Derbe. And they go to the surrounding places, but notice what they are continuing to do. They keep on preaching and teaching. I mean, this is what boldness looks like. Are they concerned about themselves? No, they're like, we're going to leave here because we know that not only are the Jews looking to stone us, now the Gentiles are looking to stone us. And if they get together, it's going to be gone. Specifically in terms of Paul, the apostle. And so they decide, you know what, we're going to keep going, but we're going to keep on preaching too. We're going to preach the good news of God about the resurrection of Jesus and sin to be forgiven.
They were concerned enough that they didn't want to stay.
Right. And yet at the same time, it's like, this opportunity's played out. Now let's go to the next one. Because you see that be their goal.
Good by going, then we can't by staying.
Staying. Right. Now, here's where it leads us. It leads us to the city of Lystra, which is a few miles away in verse 8. And you get an illustration of these signs and wonders that were being carried out right in front of the people. At Lystra, a man was sitting who had no strength in his feet, lame from his mother's womb, who had never walked. Just given one verse, tell me what you know. Lame? From birth. So it's not that he lost the ability to walk, it's that he had never walked. Now, I want you to think in these terms. Have you ever known somebody who is that way? That they have never taken a step in their life? And to think of all that goes into tending to and caring for this soul. And so here's this man, doesn't give you a name. He says, lame from his mother's womb. So this is not a regaining of something. This is something they never had. And he had never walked. Verse 9. This man was listening to Paul as he spoke, who when he had fixed his gaze on him and had seen that he had faith to be made well. Now, just take that for surface value. What had Paul noticed about this man? He is listening intently enough for it to be known that he is responding out of faith. Now, he says, so that he could be made well. What was Paul on the lookout for? Faith. I just want you to kind of think in a general way here. I'm not talking about looking into people's hearts. But can you see when people truly respond out of faith in the midst of difficulty? Can you tell whenever there's a shrinking back from faith? Sometimes. Now, it doesn't make us an accurate, judge of those things. But to realize there are times where faith is so prevalent, you can even see it on the outside looking in. Now, is that the kind of life that we live toward God? And it's not going around saying, it's not like this lame man saying, I got faith, I got faith. It's just the way that he's listening to the words that Paul is saying about Jesus. Something about that let Paul know this is a man who's responding out of faith. He can be made well. Then, verse 10. So with a loud voice, stand upright on your feet. Not very many words, right? He doesn't say, now I'm going to perform a miracle. He just tells the man who had never walked a day in his life, he says, stand upright on your feet. And he leaped up and began to walk. Now, I noticed a minute ago whenever I asked, have you ever known anybody who's never taken a step in their life? And some of you go, yeah, I've known, and you probably think of their name. You could think of them just that quick if you've known someone like that. If you heard that they could walk, what would be your response? Joy? Amazement? Marvel? Wonder how. We would probably be people go, is there some new medical treatment that allows for that to happen over time? If you notice, there's no physical therapy going on here. This is not a slow, gradual process. And you look at what's going on. He just says, stand upright on your feet. Did he follow that? In abundance. He says, stand, and he leaps.
And the man didn't ask to be here.
All right, he didn't even ask. And so he says, stand upright on your feet. And he leaped up and began to walk. Verse 11. Notice what happens. When the crowd saw what Paul had done, they raised their voice, saying in the Lycaonian language, the gods have become like men and have come down to us. Now, I want you to realize a little something. I want to give you a little history on this, and you can go read more of it on your own. About 50 years before this time here in Lystra, there was a Latin poet by the name of Ovid, O-V-I-D. And he wrote a widely known myth. It was not, he never put it forward like it was a true story. He wrote it so that everyone knew that it was a myth. And it was an epic poem. You would probably think the term would be metamorphosis. But it's a story, a myth, about Zeus and Hermes, the Greek gods, about them coming around to the area of Phrygia, which is this area here. And they knocked on people's houses looking for hospitality. They knocked on 1,000 doors. And it wasn't until they came to the specific home of 2 individuals that they were even welcomed in. And because of the lack of hospitality, there's a big flood that came over the area and destroyed everybody. Now, it's all a myth, even put forward as a myth. But whenever you start planting those kind of ideas in people's minds, especially when you hear, and the whole place gets flooded and destroyed, not a worldwide flood, it's just aerial flood. Well, does it sound like it had an effect on these people? I mean, to see a miracle and go, these are the gods, they've come to visit us. I mean, doesn't that seem like a bit of a leap? And to realize it's because of the story. And you can go read the entire myth if you want to. It's up to you. But what he lays out, and then notice the next couple of verses, because they sound just like you're reading the old myth. Verse 12. And they began calling Barnabas Zeus and Paul Hermes because he was the chief speaker. Notice, they don't ask any questions. Like, I wonder who this is. And it just so happens it's the exact 2 same gods that are in that 50-year-old story, the made-up, widely known myth of these 2 in terms of Zeus and Hermes. Now, of course, notice how they do the attribution. Zeus is the chief god in Greek mythology. And Paul even tells Timothy, look, don't go into mythology. He says, don't use that to teach the gospel. That's not the way to go, which also tells you something else. What are the myths of today? I don't know if you've noticed this or not. TV. Yeah. I mean, television programming, movies, TV shows, books, all those kind of things. You go, if you've ever wondered why, this is just me, I don't use movies and TV shows as illustrations for things because Paul told Timothy not to do it. So do you think it's a good idea? No. You realize I may use a general idea, but I'm not going to use filth to try and illustrate the Almighty God. I'm not going to use made-up stories to illustrate the genuine God. So here, these people were so captured by the mythology, even stories have been told 50 years before, that it affects the way they process what's going on right in front of them. Now, sometimes we see situations and we go, oh, this reminds me of a TV show. The right progression is, how does this remind me of the life of Jesus to see the direction I need to go? That's the right direction. So, whenever they lay it out, he says, they call Barnabas Zeus because Barnabas isn't saying much. He says, and Paul Hermes because he was the chief speaker. And in Greek mythology, Hermes is the messenger. All right. I don't know if you've ever seen the logo for Goodyear tires. It's 2 little shoes with wings on them. Yeah. The winged messenger, you know who that is? Hermes. It's like, take it fast. And that was the idea. So since Paul is the chief speaker, they call him Hermes. They're trying to fit things together in their own mind, even though they're dead wrong. So, verse 13. The priest of Zeus, whose temple was just outside the city. Oh, how convenient. So, you see where the city is. There's a temple to Zeus right outside of Lystra. And so he comes up, and he brought oxen and garlands to the gates and wanted to offer sacrifice with the crowds. I mean, they're here. Let's just go ahead and worship them. Ooh. Now, people like a lot of praise. I don't think that's any surprise. But I want you to notice, Paul and Barnabas are going to say, no, this is not to be done. Because look at how it continues. Verse 14. But when the apostles Barnabas and Paul heard of it, they tore their robes and rushed out in the crowd, crying out and saying, men, why are you doing these things? We are men of the same nature as you, and preach the gospel to you that you should turn from these vain things to a living God, who made the heaven and the earth and the sea and all that is in them. Stop what you're doing. This is senseless. And I want you to notice the way that Paul talks about himself and Barnabas. He says, we're the same nature as you. We have flesh and blood. It doesn't mean that they have the same mindset. I mean, Paul and Barnabas working off a spiritual mindset. This crowd's working off of a fleshly mindset. I want you to see how fleshly it is. Who are they going after? What they want to do. The priest from the temple of Zeus comes in with the garlands and the oxen. He says, hey, let's offer up sacrifices. This is a good PR move. Hey, let's get everybody together. And you go, no.
It's like they were an idol.
Exactly like being an idol. Let's take a look at that thought. Look over at 1 Corinthians chapter 12. 1 Corinthians chapter 12. Just want to look at the first two verses. Paul's going to use really chapters 12, 13, and 14 to talk about the proper use of spiritual gifts, things that God gave through His Spirit. He says, now concerning spiritual gifts, brethren, I do not want you to be unaware. I don't want you to be ignorant about what God is trying to use these things for. In Corinth, they were thinking if they had certain spiritual gifts, they were like a hierarchy. If you could do this spiritual gift, you were better than these other people. If you could do this one, you were better than these other people. That was not at all the purpose of spiritual gifts. The purpose was for the building up of the body in Christ. Spiritually built up. Not, hey, look at me. Verse 2. You know that when you were pagans, you were led astray to the mute idols, however you were led. Now, just in verse 2, what words stick out to you? Pagans, idols, astray, mute. When you think about it in terms of a mute idol, is the idol doing any talking? No. So who's got to make up the words? The people do. Let's see. Was there a priest back there in Lystra that was doing the speaking for his God? Yeah. Oh, yeah, the God of Zeus. We should offer up sacrifices. Well, it's not as if anybody in that temple was making a statement to these pagan gods, these mute idols. So, if you notice here in verse 2, he says, you know that when you were pagans, you know that whenever you were led by your own desires, he says, you were led astray to the mute idols. The idols weren't saying anything. And then if you notice the tail end of verse 2, he says, however you were led. How many people are their own idol? I'm going to do what I want to do. Is that a spiritual mindset? The spiritual mindset says, I'm going to do what God wants me to do. It's not about me. I'm His servant. So that means I've got to listen to what He desires, what He wants, what pleases Him. But so often, idolatry turns right back around to say, what do I want in this? How do I want this to turn out? How do I shape this to be what I want it to be? Doesn't that sound just like that priest of Zeus? He's got his mind made up, doesn't he? Now come back over to Acts 14. So whenever you see the point here, when he makes a statement, he says, Paul and Barnabas, when they hear about what this priest of Zeus wants to do, who's working off of a made-up story that Ovid wrote 50 years before, you realize, how far away have they gotten from anything that's true and genuine? It's just not there, is it? Think people still operate this way today? Certainly, certainly. They might not call it, oh, this is an idol made out of concrete. I don't know if you look through Jeff City lately, there's a lot of concrete idols. And people get led by them. Isn't that something? Think you're going to bow down before a piece of concrete? Does that make any sense? And you're going to be led however you want to be led, right? So we've got to be careful with these things. So what he lays out here, you see in verse 15. He says, men, why are you doing these things? What an excellent question. Why? What is motivating you here? He says, we are also men of the same nature as you. We have flesh and blood, we have a heart, we have a brain, just like you. He says, and preach the gospel to you that you should turn from these vain idols to a living God. When something's in vain, what is it? Useless. It's like trying to rake up leaves on a windy day. You can use all kinds of effort, but you're not going to get much accomplished. Right? So he says, you should turn from these vain things. You're offering up sacrifices to a false idol. He says, you should turn to the living God. Because what does the living God actually do? He created it all, His power, and He speaks. He actually speaks. Then, verse 16, he says, in the generations gone by, He permitted all the nations to go their own ways. He allowed those things to take place. All these foreign gods, all these false gods, pagan gods, He allowed those things to continue. Now you also note there were times at which He said that's going to be the last of that. And judgments came down against nations, against peoples. Then notice how He continues, verse 17. And yet He did not leave Himself without witness. He says, yet He left a voice that anybody could hear. And look at the witnesses talked about. In that He did good and gave you rains from heaven and fruitful seasons, satisfying your hearts with food and gladness. What is His witness? His sustaining us. He says, have you noticed that the rains come in the spring? Have you noticed the sunshine that comes? That the crops would grow? That you could go out and you could harvest every year. You can even set your calendar by it. He says, and you've been able to sustain yourselves by good. You're not talking about good acts. He's talking about, look at what He's done. Satisfying your hearts with food and gladness. Typically, people are pretty glad when it comes to harvest time. Right? It's funny, even in our own language, we have terminology for it. Man, we had a heyday. Heyday, if you ever buck bales, it's not that much fun, but realize, whenever you got it all loaded up and it's time to sell it, man, it's a heyday. We even talk about things that way, don't we? So, you notice for Him, He says, look, God has left a witness. Now, I want you to think about it. In all your life, have you ever had a year that didn't have seasons? That didn't have a planting season, that didn't have a growing season, that didn't have a harvest season, and then a time of cold where the ground would be renewed, and then you can come back and do it again next year. Do you ever think of that as being a witness for God? Because it's exactly what He told Noah it would be. After the flood, God tells Noah back in Genesis, there's going to be seed time and there's going to be harvest. There's going to be cold and there's going to be warm. He says, you're going to see it happen. And for Noah, he got to see it over and over and over again. Especially when you consider that Noah doesn't die until he's a well old man. I mean, I don't remember his age off the top of my head, but he's more than 700 years old. How long would you have to see that before you recognized who's in control? Now, He says, He did not leave Himself without a witness. Verse 18. Even saying these things with difficulty, they restrained the crowds from offering sacrifice to them. What does the crowd still want to do? Sacrifice. Now, I want you to notice, they're still being led however they wanted. He says, even with difficulty, they restrained the crowd. And then notice what happens, verse 19. But Jews came from Antioch and Iconium, and having won over the crowds, they stoned Paul and dragged him out of the city, supposing him to be dead. Now remember, back in Antioch in chapter 13, there were some pretty rowdy, riled up, ungodly Jews. Then you came to Iconium. There's a bunch of rebel rousers there, disbelieving Jews. They take these mobs of groups and they come down to Lystra where Paul and Barnabas are, and they come and they won over the crowds. And it's not just the Jews. They won over the Gentiles too. And they go, he says, they stoned Paul. Now, remember why he left Iconium? He had heard about their plans. They wanted to stone us. So they said, all right, well, we'll go and we'll travel to Lycaonia and Lystra. And yet, the crowds still find him. Now, you might look at that and go, oh man, why did God allow that to happen? Well, hang on, let's take a look. He says, having won over the crowds, they stoned Paul and dragged him out of the city, supposing him to be dead. Now, look at what they do. They stone him to the point that they think he's dead. Then they see him as being dead, so they just take him and they drag him out of the city. Now, I don't know how old you were the last time you were actually dragged. That's not a fun experience. I mean, I know sometimes my kids will find a nice tile floor like this and you put down a nice blanket or something. You can pull each other around, have a lot of fun. But to literally be dragged down some form of a path, dirt, rock, whatever, how far could you get dragged before you really look pretty bad?
Well,
They had already stoned him, so you realize it's bad to start. And they drag him out of the city, and you can almost see him just go, boom. And they walk back into the city. Now, this tells you a little something about people's desires. Whenever the man is healed, what do they want to do? They call Paul and Barnabas what? They're gods. And then yet by the end of the story, they think they're dragging out Paul's dead body outside of the city to dump his body there. That's a good question. I don't know. What about Barnabas? You look. Why not him? Well, maybe you think of the other one. Don't kill the messenger. Well, they heard Paul in speaking these things, and so Paul's the one that they go against. So here they are. They drag him out of the city, supposing him to be dead, verse 20. But while the disciples stood around him, notice who's still there. The disciples. They don't give up. He says, but while the disciples stood around him, he got up, and notice what does he do? He entered the city. Now remember, they thought he was dead when he went out. So just imagine their thoughts whenever he comes walking back in. I mean, I want you to really think about it. If they believed that he was dead, which he was not, what would they have to think about now? And like I said, this doesn't get cleared up for them. It's not like there's a speech of, he really wasn't dead. You tried hard. But to realize, for him to walk back into the city tells you about the boldness that he had from God and how badly he wanted to take this message to people.
I think it also shows us the Holy Spirit working within.
Definitely.
And to the disciples that were there, that stayed with him, how much that would strengthen.
And we're going to take that thought and go a little bit further. Just notice the end of verse 20, because this is where we're going to end. He says, the next day he went away with Barnabas to Derbe. And Lord willing, next week we'll start right there with Derbe. But I want you to look at the heart of Paul. This sounds like it would be a pretty deflating experience, doesn't it? I mean, whenever we suffer for doing what's right, it makes us go recalibrate. Am I doing what I'm supposed to be doing? Should I have done it different? Look over at 2 Timothy chapter 3. Because we really need to see the mindset and the strength that Paul is working off of, and to see that it's beyond him in terms of, here's the Spirit of God at work within Paul. 2 Timothy chapter 3, look down at verse 10. And of course, here's Paul writing to Timothy, young preacher. He says, now you followed my teaching, conduct, purpose, faith, patience, love, perseverance, persecutions, and sufferings. That's a pretty good list. He says, you followed. He says, my teaching, you saw how I acted among people. He says, you saw the purpose that was driving me. You saw faith at work. He says, you saw my patience with people whenever they didn't do what was right. You saw the love in terms of self-sacrifice, the perseverance to keep on going even through difficulty. He says, the persecutions, you saw those. He says, and the sufferings. He says, such has happened to me at Antioch and Iconium and at Lystra. You don't typically think about Timothy being there. He says, but you saw it. Now, if you notice the next aspect, these next few words might throw us. What persecutions I endured, and out of them all the Lord rescued me, delivered me. Would you describe being stoned to the point where you were left for dead and go, the Lord rescued me? Now, let that soak in for a minute. So often whenever we suffer, what's the kind of fleshly questions we ask? Why do I have to go through this? Why don't you come to my aid? Why don't you rescue me? What did Paul see?
He was thankful. He's like, this is going to just make me even stronger.
It's just,
And, sometimes when we go through hardships and when it looks hopeless, and all of a sudden, we see the Lord working and He gives us one little light, and, then you say, okay, now I see, why the purpose of it.
right. You see, look, this is what God is doing to deliver me, to rescue me. So often we just look at the physical side. Look at the spiritual side. What am I learning? Because what would Paul have to think about? Am I really putting the gospel in front of people, no matter what it costs me? Now remember, Paul had been on the other side of this coin also, in terms of being the one who's persecuting. And to see people remain true and faithful to God even to the point of death. So what does that really engage within Paul? How could I give up? To see the faith working in people right there in front of him as he was persecuting them. To now be on the side of being persecuted and to go, look at how the Lord rescued me.
And Jesus told him, I'm going to show you how much you're going to have to suffer.
Says, that's right.
I remember that when he was rolling down that hill.
And you see it. And then notice the next statement, verse 12. Indeed, all who desire to live godly in Christ Jesus will be persecuted. Now, it doesn't mean you're going to have stones thrown at you. But realize, if we're really going to live a godly life, in other words, striving to live like Jesus, striving to love like Jesus, striving to endure like Jesus, striving to be patient like Jesus, what do you know is going to happen? You will be persecuted. I remember hearing in a class one time, somebody went through this and he says, well, I don't think this is really true because I've never really been persecuted. What do you think that really means? Are we really living godly? That's the real question. And like I said, it's not always that you get stoned to death. It's not always that somebody comes against you and puts a gun up to your head. It's the idea of there's going to be pushback from the world when you strive, even in forgiving people. You'll say, I wouldn't forgive them. I wouldn't expect you to. You don't know Christ. Marilyn.
It's not just in living the godly life, it is speaking, just being a witness for the Lord. It is sharing the faith and the truth of the gospel.
Right.
That really we're going to hear about.
Right.
They kind of like your love, and you kind of like your forgiveness, but when you speak into them, their need for those things.
Right. And there's actually a passage in Romans 5 that talks something kind of similar, where Paul's going through and he talks about, when someone would die for a good person, but not too many people would die for a righteous person. We go, oh, they do good things. And you go, oh, I like them. They make me feel good about myself. Somebody who's righteous, looking at Jesus, we go, ooh, he really separates himself out. And that's kind of a similar mindset there. All right. So you really get to see the heart of it, and really what Paul is trying to see that Timothy understands as well. Whenever you endure persecution or have to encounter it, don't give up. Dig in. Keep going. All right, Lord willing, next week we'll come back and we'll start in the city of Derby.